On today's World Insight, a dialogue on China between the U.S. and European Union. Why diplomacy to single out a third party? What's the agenda? And the China question and the fast approaching U.S. elections. Any chance for pandemic cooperation? The future of rocky relations. Thoughts from a Columbia professor.
Both parties has been anti-China during this campaign. Indeed, sometimes they're competing. Who can be tougher on China?
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live on CGTN. I'm Tian Wei. We begin with the new EU-U.S. dialogue on China. The dialogue between the United States and the European Union got off the ground last week during a call between Secretary of State Mike Pompeo from the U.S. and his EU counterpart, the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. They also discussed a range of issues of common interest. The next high-level meeting between EU and U.S. diplomats is set in November. In fact, the middle of November, after the U.S. presidential election. In recent years, issues about China have become a hot topic in Europe and certainly in the United States. Where is this new bilateral dialogue likely headed? We are so glad to be joined by a panel. For more on the U.S.-EU dialogue in Brussels via Zoom, we have Peter Chase, Senior Fellow from the German Marshall Fund of the United States. In Chapel Hill, also in the U.S., Klaus Laris, originally from Germany, Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs from the University of North Carolina. Last but not least, in Beijing, Cui Hongjian, Director of the European Studies Department, China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. It's wonderful to see all of you once and again. My greetings in this very critical juncture, I guess, when we are facing COVID-19 as a world together. Let me begin by asking our two guests coming from Europe, wherever you are based. Mr. Chase, how do you see the necessity of this dialogue? It is more pro-China or against China alliance in the making? Some wonder.
Well, thank you very much for having me on your program today. And I don't think that it's, quote, against China. I think that two countries, all countries, always talk about their own relationship, but they talk about their relationship with other countries as well. And I know that I was a U.S. diplomat for many years, and during the time I was a diplomat, we talked frequently about China, like we would talk about India or Australia or Japan. This specific dialogue with Mr. Pompeo and Mr. Borrell is in the context of, but is in a very special context, however. And it's the context that was pointed to early in your program of heightened tensions between the United States and China.
Interesting. In that sense, will Europe play a role in this heightened tension between United States and China? Particularly with the election in the U.S., nobody knows where the wind blows, so what's going to be next? Professor Laris, maybe you have a better information?
Well, I would agree with the previous speaker that, to have such a dialogue is nothing dramatic, is nothing radically new, and it doesn't mean that the two continents, Europe and America, are ganging up on China. It's just as a normal consultation dialogue. Actually, in the last year of the Obama administration in 2016, such a dialogue already existed at the working level. And also when you think back to the 1990s, actually the EU and China have instigated a bilateral dialogue, a political dialogue, a legal dialogue, also human rights dialogue. And the same applies to Germany, where such a German-Chinese dialogue was instigated in the late 1990s. So to have now something like that happening again, perhaps at a slightly higher level between the EU and China, I think is nothing to worry about. However, of course, it has to be seen in the context of the forthcoming election and also in the context of the investment treaty which the EU and China are trying to conclude by the end of the year. I understand that good progress has been made. Actually, I understand China has made a few concessions regarding subsidies and the role of state-owned companies. And of course, the EU can demonstrate by entering that dialogue with the US right now. They can demonstrate to China that they have alternatives, that they have another partner. So perhaps China, they are wondering, should hurry up with the investment treaty and make some more concessions, and be also keen on concluding that treaty by the end of the year, as has been arranged. And as you know, there's not very much time left until the end of the year has arrived.
We're looking forward to see, of course, the election result of the United States first. We hope it would not be too much lagging behind the exact voting date before we know the results. But having said that, though, Mr. Cui, both of our two guests coming from the U.S. and Europe is trying to brush off the suspicion whether this is targeting at China as an anti-China alliance. Both of them talk about bilateral mechanism. Yes, they do exist. But bilateral mechanism against a third party certainly is an interesting thing, isn't it? Mr. Cui, what is the take and the perspective from China?
Firstly, I think that I agree with some viewpoints. It's not, targeted to China and to fight against China. But we cannot find out the background, because this dialogue proposed originally by European Union side. And I think that it's a very, very remarkable stress response from the European Union side during the COVID-19, because we find out during the COVID-19, European Union found that the Europe maybe is nearly out of this big power gaming, especially between China and the United States. And so European Union tried to show its existence and also its visibility in this kind of a big power gaming. So to be part of this big power gaming between China and the United States, I think it's the original, purpose of the European Union side. Another interesting issue is, if we look at this major themes of the dialogue, human rights, security, multilateralism, I can say that it could be a mixture of requirements from the European Union and the United States. If we look at this multilateralism, I'm wondering that United States is a good, talker in this, dialogue with the European Union. But I think that the European Union tried to impose some influence on the United States on American policy towards China. So to shape a kind of China-U.S. relations, and maybe to provide a kind of role as a balancer or even a mediator between China and the United States would be the major purpose from the European Union side.
Well, it seems that everybody has something to take away. Certainly, that's I guess it makes sense to have something like that, a bilateral mechanism, even though it is targeting at a third party. Having said that, though, across the Atlantic, the relationship has been quite complicated, shall I put it that way, over the past 4 years, to say the least. Multilateralism or unilateralism is only one of those. There are many others issues regarding trade policies. There's also about the quality of leadership. And there's, of course, very different approaches regarding COVID-19 and fighting against the pandemic, and what leadership means in that regard. So how should we see the two sides, Brussels and other capitals in Europe, and Washington, trying to resolve some of these differences? Is it still ever possible, 5 days before a presidential election for this administration in Washington with Europe? Professor Laris.
Yeah, you're quite right. Transatlantic relations have been very difficult during the Trump administration. There's no doubt about it. Trump personally has no understanding for the European Union. He has no sympathy for the European Union. He has an open dislike to German Chancellor Angela Merkel, one of the most important politicians in Europe. That doesn't quite, the same doesn't quite apply to Pompeo, the Secretary of State. Pompeo knows the value of the European allies much better than Trump. He also has no political or personal animosities with any of the leaders in particular. So, and I think that Pompeo and the State Department is behind that new dialogue between the EU and the US is telling. It didn't come from the White House, it came from the State Department, because they understand the importance of the European allies much better. But in Europe, it is clear that if Trump has a second term, they will be all very disappointed. And there's not much hope, even if Pompeo stays in office or if some other person succeeds him, who is perhaps slightly more pro-European, but there's still not much hope that a second term, that a second Trump administration will really be much more constructive on Europe. So everyone in Europe really hopes that Biden will become American president. And then I think we see a new engaged and new in constructive transatlantic relationship. And then I think China probably will be worried about that, and they know that Biden will be more engaging with the Europeans and probably will, will try to coordinate policy between Europe and the United States towards China in a much more constructive way than Trump has ever been able or competent to do.
Professor, I really enjoy your analysis, but I also have noted there are a lot of assumptions in the analysis, because every step of the way, a lot of question marks over there. We do not know whether there's something like that is going to happen. Mr. Chase, though, from your perspective, how should we understand the two sides trying to establish a mechanism right at the end, almost, of an administration? We do not know the election result once again, but it's very interesting. It could be very short-lived for just a few weeks, or not even a few weeks, because the first meeting will only happen after the election day, and it could be another president.
Well,
that's
actually,
very true, but it was suggested in June already.
Mr. Chase, please. Mr. Chase, please.
Yes. Can you hear me?
I can hear you very well. Please go ahead, sir.
All right. So I think that it's in November, it will still be Mr. Trump who is president. The change would only come in January 20th. But I think that it represents something more important than that. I mean, I think that you're aware that early in 2019, the European Union adopted a China strategy. And it looked at its relationship with China from beginning to end, and it realized that it was multifaceted. That there are many places where China and Europe need to work together, there are places where they compete economically, and there are places where they have some rivalries, some differences. And I think well before that, the Europeans had wanted to and had tried to speak with the Americans about many things related to the rest of the world, but including China. I think that in this case, the Europeans proposed this idea of a high-level talk because while there have been a lot of lower-level talks, even during the Trump administration, there was a need in Brussels, a need among European capitals to make sure that the Trump administration understands that Europe is an ally. And because it's an ally, the Trump administration should treat the Europeans with respect. One of the areas that the Europeans know the Trump administration is very concerned about is China. So it's actually quite natural for them to say, we're here, we want to work with you in general, including on this area that we know is important to you. You mentioned earlier the question about multilateralism. I think that the Europeans put that in the agenda, in part because they think that the United States trying to have in its bilateral relationship with China being too, I don't know, maybe aggressive. And the Europeans feeling that if the approach in talking with China, the Chinese people, Beijing, is done in a more multilateral way, then you can take some of the antagonism out of it, the bilateral antagonism that the Trump administration has talked about. And I think that that's actually a good idea, not so much to be a mediator, but simply to broaden the field, to broaden the way in which issues are discussed. And that makes a lot of sense to me.
On the other hand, though, Mr. Chase, how much bargaining power the European capitals have toward Washington? That's an interesting question, isn't it? That Washington, during this administration, will not even, care to discuss some of the issues such as multilateralism with its European counterparts. And they will listen to the advice or the shall we say, the tendering voice coming from the European capitals towards China? That's a very interesting question to me. Very briefly from you, Mr. Chase, if you can, and then I move on to the Mr. Cui from China. Mr. Chase first, please.
Yes, Washington will listen, but the current president likes to do things his way. And in that sense, one never knows how much, Washington will listen, but will Mr. Trump listen? Those two things can be different.
Mr. Cui, this president inside the U.S. is a unique one, some suggest, but it also has been demonstrating how the presidency of the United States is working with its overall political system, how much executive power a president could have over the overall system by making important decisions, such as from climate change deals or WTO or WHO, and the list could go on. But Mr. Cui, my question is coming from another direction. That is, how do you see China's attitude? You earlier helped me to analyze what do you consider as the Europeans and the American perspectives in terms of forming this platform. What about China? How will China take it? I'm sure the other two guests are also curious about that.
I think to some degree there's a lack of influence from Europe towards the United States is a kind of movement from momentum from European Union side to have this dialogue with the United States. But of course, now this presidential election will be a very decisive, factor. Once there is another 4 years for Mr. Trump, I think that this kind of dialogue on China will be very, very symbolic. But I don't think it will have some substantial results. Once there is Democratic and Mr. Biden, I think that yes, maybe from United States and from a European side and China, there will be some more complicated relations. For example, on some regional and also global issue like climate change, maybe there will be some new cooperation between China, United States, and Europe. But of course, on some other issue, especially some bilateral issue, certainly United States will try to get some more support from European Union. But I'm wondering that the European Union will try its best to support United States. Anyway, now this very, very deep economic interdependency between China and the EU will be a very, very, game changer for this kind of trilateral relations. Even now, I think that the European Union tried to introduce the United States more into this kind of globalization or some more economic or some other cooperation with China. So I think that would be a constructive way from China's perspective.
Okay. We have seen the analysis from all sides, so let's talk about some specifics. I guess only specific issues could help us to see the picture even clearer, particularly when it comes to real cooperation, if there is any. Some of the immediate challenges for all of us, gentlemen, of course, is COVID-19, how the world as a whole will deal with the pandemic. Because if one country or one city or one county is not clear with this pandemic, the rest of the world is still going to be in danger, not to mention the recent spikes coming up during the winter time. That's one thing. The other thing is about climate change, if that is a common issue. By the new administration inside the United States, the current one is not. That means also global cooperation. China talk about 2060, the new pledge. So that's a very interesting development. How will China-Europe work with that? And if change in administration or not, how will Washington walk its way in or away even further? There's other issues about the economy. Everyone is suffering as a result of the pandemic, and the economic consequences are severe for anyone. Even though China's economic growth rate coming back to the positive side, unlike the rest of the world, but still much lower than it used to be. So how to work together on that point as well. So these are issues that's likely to have huge impact on the domestic constituencies in every country we are talking about, Europeans, U.S. and China. I know as a host I've been talking too long, but we have to lay out these very specific issues out there and how we're going to deal with it and how the three sides, if there's any cooperation, going to work that out. So, Mr. Chase, when you see a platform like that, how much do you think there can be cooperation in these fields? Concrete results, immediate, lower hanging fruits.
Well, there certainly should be. I think that I've worked with scientists in China, in Europe, and in the United States. I think the scientists work together well. I think that, in fact, the pharmaceutical companies and the people who do medicine and health actually work well together. And as people, all of us, humanity, are dealing with the disease, with the pandemic, and obviously you can have very, very smart scientists all over the place who need to rely on each other and the developments they all have in order to develop the vaccines and medicines that are going to be critical to addressing it. And I think, I think that even the people in the Trump administration understand that cooperation on the pandemic on COVID-19 is essential. I think climate change is interesting because COVID-19 is an immediate issue. Climate change is a much more long-term issue, and it's there that cooperation is, again, extremely important between us and among us. I think that while Mr. Trump has difficulties just dealing with climate change as most of us understand it, that there are a lot of other places in the United States, a lot of other states, a lot of other cities, actually, who are engaged and who engage with their Chinese counterparts.
Yeah, but federal leadership is extremely important, as we all know. It's reflecting in the pandemic. So it's going to be a very different story if it's not from the federal level. Yes, please go ahead. We have a limited time left.
No, that's basically what I want to say. So I think that there should be cooperation.
Okay.
I think it actually takes all parties, though. I think that China needs to be willing and needs to indicate that it's willing as well to cooperate with the United States, even with the problems that are going on.
Okay. Mr. Arias, we know that the U.S. is not pledging the vaccine research development inside the country or about American companies to the international platforms of COVAX. China did recently. And we know China and European countries are also working on some of the cooperation projects. I'm not trying to distance one party from the overall discussion, but that is just a matter of fact. We know that the U.S. is not supporting WHO either, which so far has been recognized as the platform. So, Mr. Larry, what is your take? My producer is telling me the time is very limited, so maybe 30 seconds for you to respond to that.
Yeah, there's a lot of cooperation. There is a lot of cooperation at the company level, at the working level, and China has just joined the COVAX initiative, where the Europeans are also very active in, which is a good sign. And I believe that the Biden administration would generally be more cooperative. The same applies to climate change. Recently, there was a meeting between President Xi Jinping and the European Union in September, and climate change was one big issue, and both sides decided to cooperate on that. A Biden administration would probably join the Paris Climate Treaty again, so I can see a lot of future cooperation. And the same applies to the economy. Only yesterday, I believe, the Trump administration gave licenses so that chips which are not being used for 5G can be sold again to Huawei. And that, I think, is a good sign of cooperation. Perhaps it doesn't go far enough, but it's better than nothing.
We are running out of time. I'm sorry, Mr. Cui, I would not have extra time for you to talk about the cooperation. I'm sure we're going to work that out if there is an agenda like that. Thank you so much, the three of you. Peter Chase, Klaus Larry, Cui Hongjian. Gentlemen, really appreciate it.